And so therefore, yes, as you say, in the realm of absolute truth, there is no space, there is no time, there is no causality. There's no thing like that. Space, time, causality come into play at the instant that relative reality is born. And that's where all these questions come from. That's where these relative perspectives come from, all these different things that you're referring to. So it's really helpful, critical, if you want to understand the Bardo Dharmata, nature of mind type stuff. You have to be able to centrifuge out relative and absolute truth, because otherwise it's super confusing. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Okay, last one, Gabriella.
Hi. I'm just going to put this in the chat as well, just for your reference. It looks quite long, but I'll make it simple. So, yeah, the juxtaposition of the two meditations this morning. Firstly, I wanted to ask whether they're typically practiced in sequence, and if you recommend that we practice those in that order, because I thought they flowed quite nicely.
You know, they're not generally presented in this kind of sequence, or at least I'm not familiar with them. This is just my utilization of these practices within the context of this particular body of teachings. And it's very cool for you that it did kind of land and have a kind of sequencing effect, because that's kind of what I hoped it would do. And so if that resonates with you and you're interested in kind of stabilizing, returning through that kind of sequence progression, fantastic. But they're generally not presented in that particular sequence.
I see. So they're not connected usually.
No, they're connected. Well, they're connected. All the practices are connected. You know, this is what's also very interesting. They're all these different practices are simply ways to work with a different display of the mind and heart. And because the mind and heart, on one level, it's nothing. No thing. On another level, as we'll see tomorrow, it's also everything. And so everything we see has particular skillful means, teachings, tools that one can work with on those various manifestations of the display to basically better relate to it, understand it, and work with it. So you can see all these practices on one level, and this is why it's so actually very, very helpful in my experience to become familiar with all these different meditations. One of the characteristics of Vajrayana, the vehicle of skillful means, there are so many practices. I find it extraordinarily helpful to do that, because you will find eventually that these practices they're fractal in nature, they're iterative, and therefore what your understanding and practice of one practice will help you with the others. And that's why for me, like, oh my gosh, I study Bardo Yoga, totally helps me with my Dream Yoga. Dream Yoga helps me with my Bardo Yoga. Nature of mind helps me with both. And so that's what's so bloody beautiful, like the Indra's net, you know, all these jewels reflected, refracted, with all these different skillful means, that fundamentally you could say in the best sense of reductionism are all reducible to the same point, where they say all dharmas agree at one point. And so they all fundamentally are brilliant reflections of this jewel of mind and heart. Then in a certain way, you'll start to see are all echoes of the so-called same thing.
Yes.
And that's why they have this kind of cohesion, so to speak. That's why you can say, well, that's connected to this. Well, because it is. But, you know, maybe somebody else would preface another practice to that. That's great. That's going to bring out a different level of connectivity. Another one will bring another. And so that's why I'm such a fan of this tradition. And let me say one thing here that Trungpa Rinpoche said about this that was really cool. One of my main teachers. He was talking about Pure Land teachings. And he wasn't being disparaging. He was just talking a little bit about the difference between classic Pure Land teachings and their quite simple approach. And again, not in a negative sense, that you recite the Nembutsu, and that's kind of basically it. You just recite, and that's fantastic. And what he said, I thought was great. Nice, lighthearted way to finish. He said, well, you know, that's great, but it's a little bit like going to a restaurant where all they serve is white rice, right? Why not go to a restaurant like the Tibetan restaurant, right? Oh my gosh, what a vast cuisine. All these different flavors and tastes, all these different things. Not to diminish white rice, but I think you get the point. Why not use all these other different skillful means? And that's my bias. That's the way I roll. I love all these different techniques and skillful means. And some will have more overt connections to others, and some may not. So whatever feels right for you, you know, if it speaks to you, kind of go with it. Okay?
Thank you. Yeah, there's more in the chat. I don't know whether we have time. It was just connecting that to the other. So like the self and other, and how we can, once we've practiced this dissolving of our anger or negative emotion, how can we connect that to the other person if they're in conflict with themselves?
Oh my goodness, that's a really great question. Well, first and foremost, you want to be a really good listener, right? That's so critical here, to really, pardon the directness, shut up and listen. And be aware of what, if you're really quiet, it's like Milarepa is saying so beautifully, phenomena are all the books one needs. Symbolic guru, if you are quiet enough, your world will always tell you what to do. You will let the environment actually teach you and guide you. This is a really critical tenet when it comes to things like death and dying. Do not come in just briefly with your highfalutin ideas, convert anybody to anything. No. Come in to an environment of death and dying with tremendous openness. There's that word again, receptivity. And then from that space, you will naturally respond, not react. Reactivity breeds contraction and karma. You respond. And so here, I wish I could give you a carte blanche answer, but it really depends on the situation. It's going to depend on how is this person manifesting? What is your relationship to them? Do you have an avenue of connecting to them? One thing that happens with really heavy contracted energies like anger or fear, look into your own experience. These are among the most solid reconstitutive of all emotions, which is why when things are falling apart, it's where people go often to get it back together, is anger. And that's why if you work around death and dying, as a professional, you will often experience anger directed at you. It's not because they're loading on you personally, it's because everything's falling apart. And anger helps bring it back together. So just understanding that will help you develop a sense of understanding, empathy, tolerance, compassion for those who are expressing it. And therefore, you can, from that stance, you can better listen, respond. And there are times when it's so solid you can't do anything about it. Literally, you just have to walk away. And there are other times when sometimes it's so bloody solid and so damaging, then you have to do something really wrathful. So I don't really want to go into what I call the four karmas, the ways to relate to circumstances. There's as you might suspect, a really vast, elegant body of teachings about how to react in this responsorial way, the way a Buddha would, depending on the situation. And sometimes, I say this because sometimes wrath is in order. Sometimes what's called the karma of destruction, which by the way doesn't create karma because it's not based on reference to self, tough love. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary. So it's hard to say, depending on the situation. You want to arm yourself with these teachings through your understanding of these practices, and then you're equipped to go in. You listen, and then you bring out of your toolkit. You pull out your prescription pad or whatever metaphor you want to use. Based on your sensitivity and insight, you're going, okay, this is what I can use with this person. It might be completely different what you're going to use with that person over there. And that's the skillful means. Skillful means, upaya, is not having people meet you where you're at. No. Skillful means is meeting people where they're at. And that's what the key is here. How are you going to know where they're at if you don't shut up and listen? And then when you know where they're at and you're in tune with them, turn into them, hey, guess what? Now you can talk to them, right? Now you can talk to them.
Thank you, Andrew. What's your number one reference for this, as in literature?
When you say this, which part of this?
This kind of dealing with conflict with the other, in terms of our spiritual approach and our responding and not reacting.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if there is a single reference here. I use both spiritual and psychological approaches to work with this. And so, the book by my dear friend Bruce Tiff called Already Free, where Buddhism meets psychotherapy on the path of liberation, that's an extremely insightful book in my opinion. You might want to look at that. I have to settle with that. Nothing comes immediately to mind as like the classic text on this. If somebody else has something they want to say, feel free. But yeah, nothing immediately comes bursting into the front and center for me.
Thank you very much.
But, yeah, you might simply just Google from a spiritual perspective what are called the four karmas.
Four karmas.
Rinpoche wrote a little bit about it. There is some literature on that. That's a way to work with this from a kind of spiritual, so-called Buddhist point of view. But again, I would equip yourself with all these different skillful means. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's why I'm such a huge fan of integral approaches. You know, draw from all the different traditions, because when you're working with all these different states, there is no one tradition that can handle them all. It's a kind of absolutism. So something like that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there. Another full day. Hope it wasn't